All right. Mr. Michael Button, great to meet you.
Great to meet you too, Steve. I'm very thankful and very grateful to be invited on your show. So yeah, hopefully we can have a fun and interesting conversation.
Yeah, I was telling you very briefly before we started recording, I was so delighted to come across your YouTube channel because I am doing a lot of research right now in different domains, and I'm very interested in heterodoxy and across academic domains. And generally, when people are talking about ancient history or archaeology, I'm sure you've seen this a million times, the epistemic quality can vary, let's say. It's such a juicy narrative, the idea that maybe we got our ancient history wrong, that people are speculative, which is fine. Speculation's fun. But generally, there's like this inverse relation between how speculative you are and how rigorous you are. And so I saw some of your YouTube videos, and like the thumbnails are really well done. And I'm thinking, okay, I know what I'm getting myself into. But I clicked, I listened, I thought, hey, who is this guy? He's he's speculating, but it's like rigorous speculation, which is exactly what we need right now. And then I was consuming more of your content, and I thought, okay, what are you doing? What am I listening to? This is some like new sort of, it's like academic, but it's also fun and speculative. So for my listeners, give me a little bit of your background here. How did you start doing what you're doing, and how long have you been doing it?
Yeah. So, well, firstly, thanks for your kind words about my channel. I try my best. I don't know I'm sure I make some mistakes somewhere, but yeah, I do try and be rigorous. And for people that don't know me, my name's Michael, and I guess I'm a YouTuber, but I make videos about about prehistory, about this great question we have regarding the origins of civilization and the big mystery cloud hanging over our deep past and our prehistoric past and who we are and where we came from and what civilization is and when it formed, how old it is, how complex it was back in prehistory, things like that. But I do all of this from the perspective of someone who has a degree in ancient history. So I studied ancient history at university for 4 years, passed with flying colors, all of that kind of stuff. But I always had some slight issues, not with what I learned on my course, but with the kind of wider, higher level macro perspective we have on history, the kind of timeline, the narrative on civilization effectively, and the story of Homo sapiens. And so I guess that's kind of where it comes from the stuff you're talking about, like me having a bit more perhaps rigor than some potentially could have when discussing these subjects. And that's because, I have that kind of academic training. I've done history at every single level, all the way through the kind of academic process, right up until it was either become a conventional academic, do my PhD, become a professor, make that my career, or not. And I obviously chose not to. I chose to branch out, and there's various reasons for that, which I'm sure we can get into. But that's kind of who I am. I've only really been doing the YouTube for like a year now, or just under a year. So it's been quite crazy, but I've been thinking about these kind of ideas and thinking about history and prehistory for a very long time. So it's not like I just jumped in and started waffling and it suddenly went well. But, I've been thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time. So,
well, congrats on your success in such a short period of time. That's an awesome story. So you're in school and you're trying to piece together the bigger narrative, trying to make sense of humanity. And sounds like you were not satisfied with the story that we're told, that we're taught in school. So first of all, can you explain kind of what the big picture story is that we've been telling for, I don't know, 70 years or 100 years, and then where you think it doesn't hold up?
Yeah, so we've always had a kind of model of the past, of the human story, of our origins, that has been consistent, as you say, for as long as we've been kind of thinking about this stuff in a scientific manner. So I guess that kind of dates back to maybe Darwin and the theory of evolution, or around that time, or at least the last century. We always had this model of our past that human beings, Homo sapiens like us, were pretty much the exact same thing, which is relatively primitive hunter-gatherer type people that lived in small nomadic bands, traveled around, following the seasons, following resources, looking for food, and living in caves effectively. And that was what humans were meant to have been doing all the way up until the Neolithic Revolution, which is at earliest date around 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, possibly a bit later, but around that kind of time. That's when the Neolithic Revolution happened. So that's the invention of agriculture. And so the story is agriculture led to larger populations of people. And this story, by the way, I don't dispute the Neolithic Revolution or anything like that. Like, that definitely happened. I kind of dispute maybe, something more complex was happening before that. But the story is, as the climate got warmer out of the last ice age, around 15,000 years ago, that led to the invention of agriculture. And the invention of agriculture led to larger populations of people, eventually forming cities, developing bureaucracy to kind of deal with the larger groups of people and the surplus of food, which led to the invention of writing, which led to what we call civilization. Now, that definitely happened. There's no disputing that the Neolithic Revolution happened, and that's what led to civilization. I have more of a kind of a problem with the idea that nothing happened before then. Because that model made sense 100 years ago or whatever, because we didn't used to think our species, Homo sapiens, were that old. We used to think that Homo sapiens had maybe been around for a bit less than 100,000 years, but then that date got pushed back to 120,000 years, and then it got pushed back to 150,000 years, and then it got pushed back to 200,000 years. And it was kind of at 200,000 years for quite a long time, like a few decades. But then in 2017, we discovered this site in Morocco where they found all these remains of ancient humans, which they initially classified as Neanderthals, but then they realized that they weren't Neanderthals, they were anatomically modern humans. They were Homo sapien, they were exactly the same anatomy as you and me. And they dated this site in Morocco, they dated these remains to over 300,000 years old. So that was an extra third, again, onto our ever-increasing history. So we were getting older and older and older. And the upper limit for the age of those fossils is about 360,000 years old. So suddenly, but I usually say 300,000 years just for a nice round number. It's somewhere between 290 and 360. But suddenly we have our species' history stretching back vastly deeper into prehistory than we ever thought. So this old model that nothing happened, which kind of made sense when it was only 50,000 years, but when it's suddenly 300,000 years, this model that nothing happened at all until
for
the Neolithic
280,000 years,
exactly, or more, it doesn't quite make sense. So that's the kind of thing I dispute on my channel.
That is fascinating. So a couple of points here. Something maybe we can talk about in more detail later, but this process of dating itself, like the methodology of the domain, I find interesting, and I guess frankly as an outsider a little suspicious, for the following reason, that in hindsight, if you've got a methodology that you're saying this is going to give us an accurate picture of the history of humanity, and by using that methodology, you end up with the number 50,000 years ago, and then a little bit later you end up with 100,000, and then 200,000 and 300,000, that implies something about the method, right? That implies, does it end at 300,000? Like, what are the chances that these oldest bones that we've discovered are literally the oldest? I think the chance of that being the case is probably very slim. So I guess that's maybe the first point. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. That it would probably be overstated to say that like this is a flawed method as demonstrated, but by the revision of the stories. But what's your take on this? Is this kind of are we being arrogant to think that we can come up with an accurate picture when the story has changed this radically in a relatively short period of time?
I think it's arrogant when people say that they know exactly what happened, in the past based on these very limited pieces of evidence. So, I mean, it's fine to date something to say, if you the earliest Homo sapien remains you'd found were 100,000 years ago, it's fine to say these are the earliest Homo sapien remains we've found. It's not fine to say we conclusively know that Homo sapiens are not older than this date, because that doesn't make sense. Because as you say, it's extremely unlikely we found the first ever humans, and that was proved to be the case as they got older and older and older. And as you say, it's extremely unlikely that these Morocco remains from 315,000 years ago, it's unlikely that they were the first ever ones. And I'm sure at some point we will find older humans. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure some people were claiming that Homo sapiens were definitely not older than the dates that kept getting pushed back. I'm not sure if everyone was claiming that. I think that I hope there's a certain amount of open-minded people in academia that at least accept the possibility that Homo sapiens could have stretched back further. But I do think it was rather shocking when it got pushed back to 315,000 years, because as I said, that was an extra 100,000 years onto our story, an extra third, and it kind of blew everything out the water, or at least it should have done. I'm not sure it actually did, but in my opinion, it
Yeah.
blew everything out the water.
Well, I think part of the problem of what's going on here is evidence like that is not isolated. So, in other words, what else has to be revised if the story that we've been telling is wrong by sixfold plus? Well, what else has to be changed? This is sort of a similar pattern you see in other domains where when you have paradigm shifts, they often, this is the theory of Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he said what happens is you've got a scientific theoretical paradigm, and then anomalies kind of keep accumulating until the paradigm breaks, and then there's a big restructuring of our theoretical models, and then we put the data into the new paradigm. And it seems like if you're off by 250,000 years plus, that you're going to have some other questions you have to re-examine. Like, is it plausible to imagine that, like we were saying at the beginning, there was no advancement from the hunter-gatherer state for 280,000 years, and then something happened, and then boom, we get the explosion of civilization. If that's not the story, then what are we left with? Are we left with speculating like there's, ancient, mysterious civilizations that are out there that we don't know about and they're lost to history? That's like this incredible, beautiful, exciting story, but are we sort of forced into that position? What are our options here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think especially in terms of history and archaeology, there are quite a few paradigms, as you say, that have existed for a long time and that are now quite outdated when you look at the evidence. So there's two major ones that I always cite, and that's the idea of human intelligence, which is quite a complex issue, and the academic consensus used to always be that Homo sapiens didn't get smart until very recently. And this is the kind of idea of the cognitive revolution. Have you ever heard of the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people have heard of it. It's a very famous book. It's probably the most popular book about prehistory or anything in that kind of realm, because, I mean, it was an absolute worldwide bestseller. Huge book, 60 million copies sold worldwide. It was published in 2011. And yeah, it was a massive book. And what it did was it kind of collected the kind of academic consensus regarding human prehistory and human intelligence and presented it in a very digestible format for the masses. And I enjoyed the book. And I think the book did a great job in a number of aspects. But one kind of paradigm that it presented was that human intelligence didn't emerge, or modern human intelligence, behavioral modernity, didn't emerge until around 50,000 years ago. And since that book, or even before that book, but in the last few decades, tons of recent evidence has emerged showing that Homo sapiens displayed what we call, modern cognitive function thousands, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of years earlier than this cognitive revolution date, which they gave as 50 to 60,000 years ago. And that's based on the emergence of this fantastic and undeniably beautiful cave art in Europe, but they used the find of that cave art in Europe to suggest that that's when humans got smart. But in recent years, a ton of evidence has emerged to completely dispute that theory, and has also emerged to show that perhaps other human species like Neanderthals were equally as smart, and potentially even Homo heidelbergensis, who are shared common ancestor with Neanderthals, were also equally smart and displayed complex cognition, which is things like symbolic arts, complex thinking, complex language, burying our dead, planning, things like that. So the point I'm trying to make is we have this paradigm through which we view history, a lens through which we view history, which is that humans didn't get smart until 50,000 years ago. And that made sense when that paradigm emerged in the 20th century or whatever. But since then, the evidence has changed dramatically, but the paradigm is still fixed. So we still view history through this lens that humans have only been smart for the last 50,000 years, but there is a ton of evidence from different kind of disciplines and different sites all across the world which really disputes that. But it takes so much time, and it takes people like ourselves screaming that this evidence now exists for the actual paradigm, for the kind of conventional mainstream view of history to actually shift. And I think it's slightly shifting on human intelligence now, but it's taking a while. So, I mean, so that was quite a long-winded kind of answer to your question, but that's one of the major issues I have with the kind of conventional view of history, is this question of intelligence.
I think that's a fascinating paradigm to poke at, for sure. There's another one I know a little bit about, and I want to hear more details. But I know a little bit about this one because Joe Rogan broke it on his show, and then everybody was talking about it, which is Gobekli Tepe. And I actually gave a talk recently in New Hampshire where I was talking about issues with various theoretical paradigms. And this one came up because as I'm learning about it as an outsider, I'm going, well, something smells a little bit fishy here. I think common sense suggests that perhaps we are in desperate need of some theoretical revision for Gobekli Tepe. So can you just explain like the basics of what Gobekli Tepe is, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions about it?
Yeah, of course. So Gobekli Tepe is this incredible site in modern day Turkey, which consists of these huge limestone pillars. There's like 200 of them. They're ridiculously big. They're all decorated with unbelievably intricate carvings. They're all arranged in these circular formations, and the site has only 5% of the site has been excavated so far, but it's already thrown a huge monkey wrench into the kind of conventional model of history, which is that civilization didn't emerge until roughly 3000 BC with societies such as ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt, but Gobekli Tepe is dated to 12,000 years ago, so it's like more than twice, basically about 3 times as old as the accepted start of civilization, but it looks remarkably like something that a civilization would build. And the thing is, it's not just Gobekli Tepe. We found around 14 other sites in the area that all consist of this megalithic architecture, of this shared symbolism, which suggests a interconnected society with complex megalithic building culture that all had a kind of shared religion or some sort of shared cultural identity, all kind of traded with each other. And it's just absolutely paradigm shifting, because nothing like that was ever supposed to have existed until, ancient Sumer, ancient Egypt, the birth of civilization, as we've been told. But this site and all the other sites like Karahan Tepe, and there's a few others, really, really, really suggest that we've got that model completely wrong.
And when you say there are these big stone pillars, some of these are like 50-ton gigantic pillars that are some of them are fairly intricately carved. And according to the Orthodox story, if we're trying to put that data into the existing theory, this is supposed to have been built by hunter-gatherers. So this is according to the Orthodox story, pre-agriculture, pre the domestication of animals, if I'm not mistaken. And so the idea that we have extraordinary engineering complexity by hunter-gatherers who didn't have the wheel at that time, that just, I'm an outsider, not expert, but it's like what's more likely that happened, or that maybe some of our stories about history are in need of revision?
Yeah, it's often people have tried to shoehorn it into the kind of conventional timeline by saying that this was just, bands of hunter-gatherers. And I mean, I guess it could have been, but you'd have to massively update your definition of hunter-gatherer so far that you're basically getting to something that's akin to civilization, because it's not just one site, there's multiple of them, and they were all clearly interconnected. And to be able to build such a site demands surplus of food, because you can't build such a site if you're spending all your time hunting and gathering for food. Right. It demands specialization, because you don't have the skill to create all these incredibly intricate raised relief carvings. Like the stone is carved around the carvings. It's not just etched into the rock. The rock is carved away from the carving. It's incredibly sophisticated stuff, and you don't get to that level of technique and that level of skill without putting in hours and hours and hours and hours. And it's not just one thing. It's huge. It's something like 50 times larger than Stonehenge. It's an incredible site, and that's just Göbekli Tepe. There's multiple ones, as I've said. So it is really a big monkey wrench in the kind of traditional narrative of history. There's also quite a lot of convincing evidence that it is astronomically aligned and potentially used as some kind of celestial calendar. It's a crazy find, and yeah, it's definitely a smoking gun for the fact that we potentially have got our story of civilization very wrong.
And so just for reference here, how old are the pyramids supposed to be?
So the pyramids are conventionally dated to 2500 BC. The Great Pyramid of Giza is, and Göbekli Tepe.
It's like 8,000 years older than that or something?
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
I mean, that's just such a... So the pyramids are closer to us in history than they are to Göbekli Tepe. I mean...
Yeah, exactly.
That is extraordinary. Now, I might be wrong about this, but I believe I was reading that the initial archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, I think, or Schwab?
Yeah,
Klaus Schmidt?
Yeah, Schmidt.
I think he had this idea that what he discovered is that... agriculture came after religious development. So in the standard Orthodox story, we have the development of agriculture and cities and civilization, and out of that you get religion. And he was saying, well, here's evidence that maybe it's the religion or the spiritual, the ethical aspect of humanity, and then out of that you get agriculture. Now, that's obviously an interesting thought. But it also seems to me there's another way to make a theoretical revision, which is just to say agriculture was developed earlier than the conventional timeline, right? Wouldn't that be?
Yeah, I mean, very, very, very possibly. I think they are starting to see small signs of evidence that perhaps there was agriculture, or at least some early form of agriculture happening in Anatolia and in that region around the much, much earlier date of Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe isn't so old that it kind of sits right at the start of what we call the Neolithic Revolution. So it's not so much of a massive jump to suggest that agriculture was present from the builders of Göbekli Tepe. But what you have to consider is that Göbekli Tepe clearly wasn't these people's or any people's first attempt at building a site like this. You don't just pick up some stones and build Göbekli Tepe. Like, there had to have been a kind of build-up of kind of acquiring of skills and building other sites that we haven't found or no longer exist and have been destroyed. You don't just immediately jump to building huge megalithic architecture with unbelievably intricate carvings, dragging these pillars across the ground, erecting them, and creating a site, as I said, 50 times larger than Stonehenge, which likely had some kind of religious or ceremonial reason for it to be built. And it doesn't make sense that it just kind of pops out of nowhere. It suggests a kind of civilization, or not civilization necessarily, but a civilizational build-up of skills and architecture. And yeah, it really doesn't make sense in many, many ways.
So if that's correct, and we've dated it to 12,000 years ago, and it looks like some type of civilization, it seems like it kind of kicks open the door to saying, okay, well, if we've established the principle that there was complex civilization at least 12,000 years ago, what about before that? So is it something like, this is, instead of the history of humanity being this sort of linear thing that just grows and grows, could this be, would this look like evidence of there being a cyclical process, that maybe if you've got advanced civilization 12,000 years ago, well, what about 12,000 years before that? And how would we even try to answer that question? Like, how deep do you go in the ground? What would evidence even look like when you're talking about that time scale?
Well, that's the thing. Like, the further back you go, it's harder and harder and harder to find evidence. And the most likely thing that would survive would be stone. So when you see Göbekli Tepe, obviously it's made of stone. So it's the exact kind of thing that would survive. But I think, as you say, Göbekli Tepe suggests that these capabilities existed far earlier. I mean, it proves that these capabilities existed far earlier than the mainstream model admit, or at least traditionally admitted. But it also shows that these capabilities could have pushed back much, much further into time, because we know that they were present before the Neolithic Revolution. So we know that it wasn't agriculture that led to cities, that led to well, maybe agriculture led to cities, but it wasn't agriculture that led to the development of megalithic architecture, which was always what was presented as the timeline. But if we can have megalithic architecture without wide-scale agriculture, which is, I think, what Gbec Tepe at least potentially suggests, then that makes the idea of megalithic construction into the last glacial period or into the last ice age, whatever you want to call it, a lot more plausible. And as I said, it has to have come from somewhere. These people didn't just develop these skills out of nowhere. Like, it has to have come from somewhere, and there must be older. I mean, Karahan Tepe is slightly older, but again, that's pretty sophisticated stuff as well. So these techniques must have developed over time and must go back deeper into prehistory. That's just logic. So who knows what we may find?
It does sound very logical, commonsensical. And yet, I know, at least maybe prior to the last decade, this would have been a very controversial claim, maybe even fringe. So how do you estimate, who more you're closer to the literature and to the whole domain of archaeology and ancient history? How are you estimating like the fringe level of some of these alternative theories? It's the idea that we have civilization maybe stretching back to the last ice age. Is that way out of left field, or is there like a growing number of people that are suggesting maybe this could be going on?
I think civilization stretching back at least, 10, 20,000 years. I don't think that is, I mean, it would be considered a fringe view, but I don't think that's that wacky to believe. To be honest, I think sites like Gbec Tepe show that the toolkit for civilization already existed much earlier than we assumed. I think once you start stretching back much deeper into prehistory, it starts to get a little bit less plausible. So, I mean, I made a few videos like, what if there was a civilization effectively 100,000 years ago? And I was just saying, I was kind of giving the whole argument that, look, we've been around much longer than we think. The traditional argument was always that climate led to agriculture, which led to the development of civilization. But now that we know our species is so old, the climate has been warm on 4 previous occasions while we've been around. And one of the most notable occasions is the Eemian period, which was from 130 to 115,000 years ago. So that lasted for 15,000 years. That's longer than the Holocene has been so far. So that was a very long and stable period of warm climate. And Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, had been around for, 2/3 of our story already by that point. We'd been around for a long, long time. So I was kind of saying, why couldn't civilization have developed then as it did in the Holocene? Now, I think it's possible that a civilization or something like it did develop back then, but I don't think it ever reached the kind of level that we have reached now. I think we would see some, I don't think they were sending rockets into space. I don't think there was 8 billion people. I don't think it was a mass industrial society. I think we would be able to see traces of that in the Earth. But if it was something on a much smaller scale, if there was just, a small state of people, a few thousand people that practice small scale agriculture, built megalithic architecture, and anything that, if we found dated to 2,000 years ago, we would class as a civilization, I think it's perfectly plausible that humans as smart as us, who had 15,000 years of warm climate to play with, could have achieved remarkable things. And the fact is, we would basically see, unless they got to this kind of industrial level, which I don't think they did, we would basically see no evidence of it today. The only possible thing that could survive would be worked stone. And lo and behold, we see mysterious human modified stone all over the world, which is dated to the time that is accepted that humans started doing that kind of thing. But as we were alluding to earlier, you can't actually date stone. You can only date organic material.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about. How are they coming up with those dates for stone?
So you date organic material or other kind of human presence, effectively, that's found near the stone, and that's the best you can do. So if you have a piece of stone and then there's a remain of someone's meal or something next to the stone, or some bones or something like that, you can date the organic material, and that gives you a radiocarbon date, and then you thus give the stone as the same age as that date. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that stone is that date. Obviously, it could do because people are going to live in the sites that they built. But people also can co-opt older things that already existed. A tribe or a group of people could find a massive ancient stone settlement that had been there for 40,000 years and could have been like, hey, cool, this is a cool place for us to set up camp and live. And then future archaeologists find those people's remains of their life and they assume that that's when the stone was built. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's when the stone was built. I mean, it still could do, but it's not like a completely foolproof method of dating stone. Far from it. We cannot date stone. So I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up on the plausibility of people building and using stone deep in prehistory, because they forget that we can't accurately actually date stone itself.
Well, what about other materials? So we've got organic materials, we've got stone. Then it seems like we got about a bunch of in between materials. Maybe there are metals and maybe ancient concrete. What's the durability? What's the lifespan on those? If there was an ancient concrete gutter somewhere, does that also decay?
Well, it depends how long you're talking, but if we're getting up to 100,000 years, then yes, pretty much everything would decay except for stone. And the only other thing that would survive would be potentially ceramic pottery. This is kind of, I always try to, try and debunk myself, if that makes sense, because I don't want to mislead people. I don't want to say anything that is falsifiable or provably false. So I always try and debunk myself. And I've really been trying hard to work out what exactly would survive if there was a sophisticated human culture flourishing in the Eemian period 115,000 years ago. And as far as I could tell, metal would be gone. Plastic, it's unlikely they'd be making plastic, but if plastic was being made, it would have been so ground down into tiny little particles, it would be indistinguishable in the archaeological record. Same with glass. Same with concrete. Same with basically everything except for work stone and ceramic pottery. Now, it's true that we do not see sculpted ceramic pottery any earlier than around 29,000 BC. So that would suggest that potentially that rules out an advanced culture 115,000 years ago. But we do see human-made clay from much, much older. Now, this clay has always been thought to have been accidentally made by fire or whatever. But it could be that this clay is just tiny little shards of what was once sculpted pottery. And because once we're getting up to the kind of 100, 200,000 year timescale, the original ceramic creation doesn't exist, but the shards still exist. Now, I don't know if that's true. Another possibility is you could have a very sophisticated culture that didn't use pottery, because you don't have to use pottery to be sophisticated, or you could use many other kind of devices, not devices is the wrong word, but things to hold stuff effectively, because that's what pottery is. You could use a basket, you could weave reeds into some sort of a container. Like, it doesn't have to be pottery. So yeah, they're the kind of only two things that I think would survive from a civilization from 115,000 years ago, is stone and ceramics.
Well, let me poke a little bit at the pottery idea. So I'm speaking from complete ignorance here, but how is it that we know that pottery would be around indefinitely? How do we come up with that knowledge? So if somebody were to say, oh no, you see, after the year 30,000, pottery decays, what's the argument against that?
I think because pottery is effectively is stone-like in nature, and so it's not going to decay. I mean, I'm not an expert on pottery decay, but as far as I could tell,
in the world,
probably isn't. But as far as I could tell, the scientific literature seems to suggest that pottery, ceramics would survive like these vast amounts of time. Because I was looking at everything, and I was finding like that wouldn't survive, that wouldn't survive, that wouldn't survive, that wouldn't survive. The only thing I could find that would potentially survive is pottery, ceramics. But to be fair, there has been like no real studies done on this, because this isn't something that people are studying. So that could be wrong.
It would be fascinating to know because that could be just an assumption that doesn't hold. It might end up being the case that pottery is less durable. If you think about it, if you take it as an empirical question, And we're not just trying to deduce something from the laws of physics. This is how long it must last, because that's generally not the best way of reasoning about some of these very, very complex questions. If you take it empirically, how would one go about figuring out the answer to that question of what happens to pottery after 30,000 years? Like that you can't, that's not the type of, that's a nice academic question that doesn't have a nice academic answer, in the sense that you're not going to be around 30,000 years to see whether your theory is correct. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the oldest we found is 29,000 years ago, the oldest actual shaped ceramics. So the argument is that humans only developed that skill at that point. But again, that doesn't really prove that, because it could have been developed earlier and we just haven't found the evidence. It could have been developed in a coastal civilization that has since been lost under the sea. So it definitely doesn't disprove anything. But I think if we had like a vast, kind of like continent spanning civilization in the Eemian period, we would see it. I think we would see signs that humans had manipulated the landscape. Well, at least if they were like us, I guess they could have been a bit different to us, and they could have not used pottery. They could have not used large-scale agriculture and stuff like that. But I think it's more likely that there were smaller cultures that were sophisticated, things that we would likely kind of see as similar to civilization, but not exactly the same. I think it's more likely that things like that were flourishing in, say, the Eemian or some other time 100,000 years ago. That's kind of more the angle I'm taking it at. I don't believe that there were vast, advanced, ancient civilizations in the deep past. That doesn't mean there wasn't. I think anything's possible, but I don't see any firm evidence for that. But I do think it's very, very plausible that sophisticated human culture, much more sophisticated than the kind of mainstream model allows, was flourishing in, say, the Eemian period, or at any given point in the last 100 to 200,000 years.
One more speculative question on this topic, and then we move on. So the time frames you're talking about are vast. What about the idea that every so often there are cataclysms that destroy a bunch of stuff that's existing on Earth? So you have, we would have seen the pottery, but 30,000 years ago, there was the global flood that happened, and then it destroyed it for whatever reason. Like, is that, and then it could, maybe not just a flood, but maybe there was the poles shifting did something crazy, or there was a comet. We can be creative in talking about the once every 25,000 or 50,000 year catastrophe that wipes everything out. Is that,
yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that kind of thing has happened, and that kind of thing has happened while humans have been around. And so I think there's a stat, something like the estimate from NASA on how often a kind of planet-altering asteroid hits the Earth is something like once every 150,000 years or something. So that obviously seems like, oh, that's like a vast amount of time that can't affect us. But then once you start to think, hold on, that we've been around for twice that long. So in theory, that's happened twice already during the kind of human story. And that's just our species. Other humanoids have been around for millions of years. So yeah, I mean, things like comet impacts, things like sea level rise is a massive one, because humans obviously have always collected around the coasts, or coastlines have always been the most logical places for humans to develop. We still see that today. Many of our major cities are on coasts. Ancient paleo lakes, ancient paleo rivers, which are no longer rivers or lakes, easily could have been, lost to them. The pole shifts, as you say, the super volcanoes, there's earthquakes, there's so many kind of like forces of nature that can absolutely erode away landscapes, erode away all sign of human habitation, all sign of human life, all evidence of sophisticated human achievement that could have happened in the deep past. And we're kind of sat here thinking, no, that's real, because we think in such short timescales, because nothing big has happened in the last, few thousand years. So we're like, well, that never happens. But this is again to this point of like, we need to update our thinking on how long our species have been on the Earth, because we've been around for so long that we have seen some shit. We have been through some crazy shit, and that has the potential to both collapse civilizations or collapse cultures, and collapse and wipe all the record clean of what they could potentially have been doing.
This is one of the reasons I sort of get more and more exponentially skeptical the deeper in history you're talking about, because there's this extrapolation where you're going, oh, look, pottery declines or decays at this rate, and look how the line goes back in this linear fashion. And you're like, yeah, but when you start talking 15,000 year earthly cycles that we know of, much less the ones we don't know of, and then 50,000 year and 100,000 year, the idea that that straight line is relevant, I just become extremely skeptical about it. You had mentioned maybe other humanoids, and this idea that maybe they weren't using pottery. There's many ways to construct things. So one other specific anomaly I would love to hear your take on is the Columbbo structure. So what is this?
Yeah, I love this site. I think this site is so paradigm shifting. It's just, yeah, I'm just flabbergasted. It hasn't like kicked up more of a fuss, but I kind of see that as my role to kind of really kick up a fuss about it. So I think that this one site disproves two major ideas we have regarding prehistory. So one is this idea of intelligence that I've been talking about, that humans didn't get smart to 50,000 years ago. And the other is that humans didn't settle down into permanent living arrangements until 10,000 years ago, or 12,000 years ago, rather, than 10,000 BC, the Neolithic Revolution. But the Columbbo structure is a site in modern-day Zambia which contains evidence of a wooden structure. So it's they found these interlocking wooden logs that were joined deliberately by humans into notches, and then the ends were tapered off, and it is deliberate construction. They think it was either a raised walkway over like some sort of marsh or bog, or a house, a shelter, some sort of dwelling. And that's literally what they say in the paper. That is their opinion on what it could have been. So, and this site is dated to 476,000 years ago, which predates Homo sapiens. They believe that this is had been built by Homo heidelbergensis. So suddenly, out of nowhere, not only did modern humans not only start living 12,000 years ago, not only were modern humans not only smart 50,000 years ago, pre-Homo sapien, Homo heidelbergensis, were both intelligent, cognitively advanced enough to plan, to engineer, to build, and were likely living in either semi-permanent or permanent settlements. And what's amazing about this site is the fact that it survived at all. Like, it's so incredibly, impossibly, unbelievably bizarre that this site has survived, because the only reason it survived was because the kind of interlocked engineered wooden logs fell into a bog at some point relatively recent to their construction in the grand scheme of things, because they were still together, still, present. They fell into a bog, and then that bog kind of dried over, and this wooden structure was preserved in this waterlogged sediment for 500,000 years until modern scientists found it. That suggests that this was not a one-off. This was just the one that unbelievably survived, but that this was something that Homo heidelbergensis were doing over and over and over, and they clearly had the ability to do it. We found it, they did it. So if they had this ability, if they had this capacity to plan, to structurally engineer, to build, to potentially live in permanent settlement almost 500,000 years ago, that kind of throws everything out the water, in my view anyway. I think it completely shatters those two paradigms of history that we've always adhered to, and I think it's an utterly paradigm shifting site, and I love it.
That's so cool. But it makes me think, going back to the methodology question, I see this across domains, that especially because of some of the paradigms we inherited from the 20th century, people are terrified of speculation without evidence. I mean, it seems so natural, right? You want to be scientific, you got to speak when there's evidence, you don't want to step outside evidence. But nature is unbelievably complex. Put it this way. Everybody who has speculated that pre-humans might have had wooden technology might turn out to be right, despite the complete absence of any evidence. And I think there's something very important to that the game of reasonable theoretical speculation, well, obviously you have to try to ground it in a good argument somehow, but you can be vindicated. Like, imagine being the guy 100 years ago that goes, I bet 500,000 years ago, proto-humans were building wooden structures, and then somebody says, "Where's your science, sir?" And he goes, "Like, I don't have any science. I don't have any evidence, but I'm theoretically speculating." He might end up being right. Is
He
there
is right.
something
It's
important?
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's say he is right. There's something deeply methodologically important about that.
Yeah, for sure. We should certainly be allowed to speculate. And then the speculation should be allowed to increase. When we find something like
Yeah,
Colombo, we should be allowed to, because obviously Colombo isn't like it's not evidence of a metropolis or a city or anything, but it could be evidence of a small little settlement. It could be evidence of, multiple
right.
huts or something, or they think maybe it was a raised walkway. So kind of, a raised kind of hut-like settlement. That seems like perfectly reasonable speculation to me based on solid evidence. And I think one of the things that people don't appreciate is just how much of the kind of mainstream view is effectively speculation, or at least it's interpretation at the very
Yeah.
least, based on tiny slivers of evidence. And they build a whole narrative around that, which is fine. That's what we do. That's how history works. And that I have the problem is when that theory that they construct around this tiny amount of evidence is presented as indisputable truth. Like, they create a theory, and that's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable theory. But then it's kind of presented as something that cannot be challenged, cannot be speculated against
Yeah.
in any way. It is truth. You cannot disagree with this. And I have a major problem with that, because I have no problems with it as a theory, the kind of mainstream model of history, but only as a theory. I don't think it's truth. I think it should be allowed to be challenged. I think it's almost certainly wrong in many different cases. And yeah, speculation should certainly be allowed in a discipline like history, where it's a lot more about interpretation than facts.
Yes, and I think that is true outside of history as well. It's actually the same pattern, believe it or not, even in the natural sciences. So a great deal of physics, let's say cosmology as a domain, is built upon extraordinary speculation from tiny little amounts of light that they get from the sky.
Yeah.
And they're like,
Yeah.
well, let me tell you exactly what was going on 14.8 billion years ago within a sliver, 100 millionth of a microsecond, this exact thing happened. And how do we know? Well, the math demands it. And I'm like, buddy, that's probably just a story. And I'm going to say there's a whole lot of room for theoretical speculation here. There's many, 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 many stories that could be told about the data that you're referring to. So it's not just natural history. This seems to be widespread. And
I think it's just a very human tendency, isn't it? We always seem to think we have the answers. If you look all the way through at history, everyone's always seems to think they got the answers, but everyone's always kind of wrong and on big level things. And there's always alternative thinkers that always prove to be right all the way through, and that will continue to be the case.
So I wonder then, this is a natural segue then to talk about academia a little bit. So as an outsider, I have a bachelor's degree in political science, so I'm a big time outsider in almost everything that I'm talking about here. It appears to me that there is, at present, a lot of dissatisfaction with scientific and academic orthodoxy, again, in every domain. And I've talked with people for many years, academics and intellectuals all over the world, and there seems to be a general, almost a mutual understanding that the dogmatism we were talking about a minute ago is the norm, actually. Like you said, this is part of the human condition, that we think we've got the truth. And then it takes a long period of time before our ideas get overturned. And I wonder, what was your experience just personally while you were in the academy? Did you get the impression, did you have admirable respect for your professors? Did you feel like, okay, let's say there was a real competence hierarchy within the domain of archaeology and history? Or did you feel like, okay, maybe I need to go outside of the academy because maybe I don't feel like there's a spirit of free inquiry here, or maybe there are competence problems, or what's your take on the situation? I'll just say, just as a brief note, there might be a difference of experience here between the European intelligentsia and the American intelligentsia. Something is profoundly wrong within the American academy. I don't know as much about what's going on in Europe right now. So,
yeah, I have great respect for everyone that I went to university with, and all my professors and my classmates. They were all intelligent people. They were all curious people, and I have no issue with what I was taught on my degree. My degree was very much focused on what is known as recorded history, it was ancient history. My degree was ancient history. So that basically started with Sumer and the invention of writing. And I have no real issue with what I was taught at a micro level, and I have no issue with how I was taught it or anyone that I went to university with. As I said before, it's kind of more, I developed these issues with the kind of wider narrative of human history and the kind of deeper prehistory stuff, the origins of civilization. And it was because of that that I felt if I had gone into, trying to become a professional academic, if I had taken the next step, which was the next step, and to make that my career and to go into do a PhD and to become a professor, I guess, in the long run, I would have struggled to be able to investigate or research the things that I wanted to investigate and research, which is the kind of stuff that I talk about on my YouTube channel, which is the kind of stuff we've been talking about today. I feel like if I had approached, a professor or a funding officer with these ideas, I would have found it extremely difficult to get funding. Because
So I'm curious, why do you say that in terms of what experiences did you have or what conversations did you have that led you to the conclusion that perhaps there would be hostility towards types of questions you're asking?
it's more, well, I mean, every time I did try and raise the kind of issue of Gbec Tepe during my course, and it was kind of brushed aside. And to be fair, Gbec Tepe is 12,000 years old. My course focuses on recorded history, which is 3000 BC. But my argument was, look, this clearly has major implications for our understanding of civilization, for the development of civilization. Why can't we discuss this here? They would have been like, well, it's not relevant, it's not on the syllabus. Maybe you should go study a prehistoric archaeology degree, like I was supposed to just switch course halfway through, and like I could possibly know that that's exactly the specific course I have to study to discuss these kind of questions. I think I felt it's slightly negative that these kind of discussions weren't welcome, even if it wasn't on the syllabus, as it were. I feel like you should at least be allowed to informally it's an ancient history course, like where I'm at pretty much the exact right place I should be allowed to discuss this stuff. But it wasn't really welcomed. And I felt that my views were kind of increasingly in contrast with that of the kind of academic establishment around me. That doesn't mean to say I ever really tested it that hard, to be fair. I never was like banging down the door like, we've got to talk about this stuff and getting like shoved out of the university. Nothing like that. So maybe it's projection, and maybe I would have received a more welcoming kind of attitude, but I strongly doubt it, to be honest. I don't think they would have been particularly happy to. I just don't think I would have got funding for the kind of research that I want to do. So yeah,
I'm going to say there is projection going on, but it's in the opposite direction that you think it is. So from my impression, you're a super nice guy. You seem very polite and kind, and so you're thinking, well, I think they would have, but polite and kind. I bet there would have been hostility, and maybe this is from my American experience, because I've talked to a lot of people who have horror stories in grad school across domains when they step out of line, and they say, listen, this is something that's obviously important. This has big consequences. It could be in biology or medicine. It could be in the domain of physics. Believe it or not, it could be even in mathematics. I don't know if you're interested in the subject, but there's a lot of the 20th century was interesting in the development of mathematics. And it's not really on the syllabus. That's not the feedback that they're getting. It's like, who are you to ask these types of questions? You better shut up. You are not going to get funding. You better not step out of line. This is not how the process works, buddy. And maybe what you can do is get tenure, and in 30 years, maybe then you can start asking those types of questions. So that's the way. And maybe I'm also biased because I talk to a lot of dissident heterodox thinkers, so everybody shares their story here. But it could also be the American experience. But I do get the impression that for whatever reason, in every domain, there are orthodoxies that form, and then there's a very human political structure, pattern, network that forms. And when outsiders in particular, or somebody like yourself is looking at the big picture, the big story that maybe invalidates some existing narratives, or is calling or saying maybe we need a paradigm shift, that is perceived as being hostile. That it's like, well, if that perspective were correct, it would invalidate the work that we're doing, or it will invalidate the work of my PhD advisor or whatever. And it's much more like actively competitive, and people are throwing sharper elbows than people on the outside like to imagine, that like academics are just getting along holding hands in the pursuit of truth. It seems a whole lot grosser than that.
They do it to themselves. They do it to each other. They're absolutely brutal to even other academics that they have disagreements with. But I mean, I think it's difficult if you've, spent a career, a life working on something, and then someone comes along and says, yeah, I think you're a bit wrong about this. It was very difficult just for a human being to kind of even want to consider that possibility. So the natural kind of human reaction is fight, squash this. I don't want to talk about this. This doesn't fit with my life's work. And I don't want to, I've been teaching about this. I've built my kind of social status upon this knowledge. And if this is wrong, then I look like, it's more than looking like a dick. My whole kind of life collapses around me. So it's a very human response to new ideas. I think we've always seen it. I think, as you say, we see it in multiple disciplines, but it's kind of unfortunate, because I wish ideas like this could be discussed in a more healthy manner.
Well, what's interesting is I think one way or another, we are going into a world in which new ideas are being discussed, but a lot of it's happening outside of the academy. Yeah. You've got a YouTube channel. I've got a YouTube channel, not as successful as yours, but a podcast where I'm just talking to people about these types of conversations. There are a bunch of dissident academics in every domain who have just found intellectual creative freedom and alternative networks outside the academy. I sort of feel like that's the trend line we've been on for some time, and it looks like it's going to continue on in the future. Also, interesting question here is money, because I know so much of academic investigation ultimately comes from grant writing. You're writing a grant to somebody to get a check cut from the government or from a big institution, and that massively restricts the scope and the ambition of academic projects. Because if you're going to rock the boat and say something that's very controversial and risk losing that grant money, there's a huge disincentive to be ambitious and come up with the new alternative paradigms, versus what we're seeing right now, which is independent thinkers online, Substack, YouTube. They've got their own networks that are coming up that seem to be producing kind of academic content without it coming from grant writing. So I love to see when you say you just started doing this like a year ago, you're obviously on the upswing. You've got, I think last I checked, over 70,000 YouTube subscribers in a short period of time. That trend line is up. And I feel pretty optimistic that if you care about scholarship coming out, maybe it won't come from the academy, but we do have alternatives here that maybe are working.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great things about the internet, isn't it? That people can, put forward ideas that otherwise would just never, ever, ever make it to the public light. Because as you say, with kind of funding and stuff, it creates a self-reinforcing loop, because if only certain topics get funding, then those topics become massively overrepresented in the kind of academic literature, and then that makes that look like that is by far the most obvious theory and is supported by all the academic papers. But when you actually dive into it, it's more that that's the kind of thing that is easier to get funding for, and thus more people research that kind of thing, write papers about that. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop. And yes, so I think the internet is a great leveler in that regard. Obviously, that does go both ways, because I mean, people can say anything on the internet, and people believe anything on the internet, so it can go both ways. But I think overall, it should hopefully be a good thing, because I think the kind of what's the word? The wisdom, the kind of the voting of the masses or the people. It doesn't necessarily mean something is right, but if something has power, if an idea has power, if a lot of people are drawn to an idea, that kind of then puts it into the kind of public square, and then it can be discussed on its own merit. So just because something is popular doesn't mean it's true. But if something's popular, it means it can be in the kind of public space where people can then actually discuss it in in a sophisticated manner, rather than it just being silenced in some academic institution somewhere and never
Exactly.
being heard of. So I think that's definitely a positive thing.
And the stories that have accumulated of heterodox thinkers being dismissed from the academy, I mean, they're extraordinary and literally in every single domain. And it's disturbing as their stories are coming out, right? We have alternative information channels that are coming up because of the internet. And I get the impression, I have a very skeptical impression of a lot of the ideas we've inherited from the 20th century. And it's in part because when you just listen to, let's say, both sides of some academic dispute, it is in fact, it's the norm for the heterodox individuals making better arguments. And this is like a general, it's obviously speaking broad brushstrokes here, but it is so common for the orthodoxy to be established. The heterodox thinker comes along and says that doesn't work, maybe for these reasons. And it's not necessarily that he's right, but that the argumentation is stronger. And for human, political, social reasons, the person gets dismissed, disparaged, maybe loses their job. And the precedent is set. Well, you better not step out of line or you're going to be excommunicated from the academy. I think if people understood the amount of non-governmental politics, and I guess governmental politics, in academia and in science, I think they would have a much more maybe pessimistic or realistic view of how scholarship works in practice.
Yeah, and it is a brutal world. Not that I've ever I can't claim to be like an academic. I obviously left before I went down that path, but it seems like a very brutal world, and ideas that aren't wanted, it's tough for them to make it until now, as we say. So maybe we are entering a new phase of kind of human civilization where ideas can break free quicker and development can be quicker, but we'll see.
Okay, I want to ask you two specific questions on this topic. I'm going to start with one that, again, I know nothing about, but this is a funny true story. And shout out to my friend Lauren, my old friend Lauren. I have a friend from upstate New York, and I saw her a few years ago. And we were talking. I have this theory I'm calling the Dark Age model, that effectively we've been living in a dark age for a little bit more than a century. The theoretical paradigms we inherited from last century in all domains are in need of desperate revision. And I was sort of going through different examples here and there of the ones that I had researched. And she has a background, I think she has a degree in archaeology. And I've had this type of conversation with old friends and colleagues for a long time, and they'll always tell me the scandals in their domain. Oh, Steve, you wouldn't believe the corruption and the theoretical paradigms that need a revision here and there. Well, her background is in archaeology. And at the time, I knew absolutely nothing. And she said, oh, yeah, let me tell you, there is so much corruption in Egyptian archaeology because the Egyptian government has taken it upon themselves to be in the process of determining what type of research can get done at what locations, what gets funding, what doesn't get funding, and it's deeply tied to their tourism industry, which is a big moneymaker for Egypt. And I just burst out laughing because I'm like, I know literally nothing about Egyptian archaeology, but I know the pattern, and that sounds like the pattern. So do you happen to know anything about like what's going on with Egyptian archaeology, or whether or not this is indeed, are there stories of corruption here? I'm just curious.
To be fair, I'm not really an expert on Egyptology either, to be honest, but I 100% think that it's in the national interest of Egypt for this kind of story to remain the same. And Egypt has a very distinct class of high-level Egyptologists, the most prominent and most famous of being Zahi Hawass, who are very, very keen to not let anything kind of disrupt the narrative regarding ancient Egypt that we've been told. And you can see this if you listen to any of Zahi Hawass's interviews and stuff. He claims that all the answers are in his book. He claims that all the answers have already been found. But if you actually look at ancient Egypt, there are so many mysteries there. I mean, I don't know anything about actual corruption, but it wouldn't surprise me at all, because that's just kind of how humans work. And I think Egypt as a society, I don't want to cast any aspersions, but I think it's quite a kind of socially stratified society. I think they have people in prominent positions, especially in the kind of cultures division of their government, that are very interested in kind of maintaining the status quo. And so any kind of major finding in Egyptology that would massively disrupt the kind of narrative regarding the ancient Egyptian past, I think is not something they would want. And I'm not basing that on any kind of knowledge of these people or anything like that, but it just seems to make sense to me that anything disruptive is something that they would not be keen to kind of look at. And I'm not saying that they're hiding the truth or anything like that, but I'm just saying they're not
The incentives
interested.
are questionable.
Exactly. The incentives aren't archaeology. The incentives aren't, finding something new about our past. The incentives are power and money. And that's always the case. That's the case in other kind of historical sites around the world. Money comes first. Tourism comes first. Göbekli Tepe, as we were discussing, big debate over Göbekli Tepe regarding how the complete priority of that site is tourism and not archaeological excavation or archaeological study. Is all completely based around tourism, and I think that's the case with many sites around the world. And it's sad, really, but again, it kind of matches human nature perfectly. So
yes,
that's how it goes.
I did. That was the other example that I wanted to ask you about is Göbekli Tepe, because I know there's been controversy with regards to the influence of money in science. So I know you did a video on this, and you mentioned the Dogus group, and so could you go into a little explainer on, give me some of the politics of what's going on with Göbekli Tepe and maybe how the money is flowing.
Yeah, so I mean, this isn't so much me. This is people like Jimmy Corsetti from Bright Insight, Mike Collins from Wandering Wolf. These are other kind of YouTubers in the space that have done a lot more work on what is happening at Göbekli Tepe than me, but I do know a little bit about it. And effectively, Göbekli Tepe was acquired, as in the site was basically bought by a conglomerate from Turkey called the Dogus Group. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce that. Sorry if anyone Turkish is listening, but it's spelt Dogus. So I'm going to say that probably almost certainly wrong. But the Dogus Group aren't an archaeological society or anything like that. The Dogus Group are a tourism company, and they own hotels, they own resorts. And now, since I think it was 2017 or something, they own Göbekli Tepe. And since then, they've poured loads and loads and loads and loads of money into Göbekli Tepe. But the excavation rate of Göbekli Tepe in 2010 was 5% of the site. In 2015, it was 5% of the site. In 2020, it was 5% of the site. In 2025, it's 5% of the site. No further excavation has been done. They're still kind of excavating the little bit that they've done, but no further excavation has been done. But they've been pouring money in to kind of creating a tourist infrastructure around it. So they built these horrific roofs that cover the site, which are just horrible. They poured concrete over the to make a walkway, which Klaus Schmidt, the original archaeologist's wife, had a huge problem with. He's dead now, but his wife was like, "This is just terrible for the site beneath it." They didn't care. There's the whole debate regarding the trees, which Jimmy Corsetti he did quite a lot on. So basically, these trees had been planted over the site of Göbekli Tepe, not by the Dogus Group, but they'd been there for a bit longer. But they were kind of planted to, I think, make the area a bit more, aesthetically pleasing for visitors, for tourists. So these trees were planted all over the ruins. And Jimmy Corsetti was kind of saying, hold on a second, these trees are planted over the ruins of the most fascinating ancient megalithic site in the entire world. And tree roots, what they do, tree roots are terrible for archaeological sites. They kind of delve into the soil, they crack the ruins underneath, and they planted them all over the unexcavated parts of Göbekli Tepe. And Bright Insight Jimmy Corsetti was kind of saying this, and then I found the reaction to what he was saying absolutely fascinating, because you had this small kind of band of archaeologists who are very, very vocal in protecting the kind of conventional timeline. And they came out, because it was Jimmy that was saying this, and they came out saying, the trees aren't a problem at all. The trees are actually good for archaeological sites. We see trees everywhere. Trees are fantastic for archaeological sites. They're no problem at all. And that was the kind of the rebuttal for a few years, until eventually only last year, the Göbekli Tepe site itself finally admitted, okay, yeah, these trees, they're seriously damaging the site below. And then they decided to transplant and move every single tree. And suddenly all these archaeologists had been actively publicly supporting effectively something that was seriously damaging a fascinating ancient site, just because, not because it was for any historical reason, but just because someone they didn't like, someone on the alternative side, Jimmy Corsetti, was complaining about the trees. And I think that was just a fascinating microcosm of how these people would kind of do anything. It's a very tribal mentality, and it doesn't matter if you disagree with absolutely everything Jimmy Corsetti says. He was right about the trees damaging the site, and they were against the removal of the trees purely because it was Jimmy that was saying it. So that's kind of the wider aspect of what's going on at Göbekli Tepe, and this major kind of priority of tourism rather than excavation. And there's just such limited excavation going on there. It's really quite sad, to be honest, given the complete historical significance of the site. So
that is fascinating. So two questions on this. First, you said this Dogus group owns the site. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's in collaboration with the Turkish government, to be fair, but because it's like a heritage site, but they run the site. They do all the kind of business administration of the site, and they take profit from the site. So visitor numbers, I'm sure the Turkish government do too, but those group they're the kind of day-to-day running of the site, and all they're interested in is visitors. All they're interested in is money coming through the door, more people coming to see the site, blah, 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 tourists into the area. Yes, we want more money. They're not interested in archaeology. And I know that that's how the world works, and I know that you need money coming in, but it's sad to see such a fascinating site have that as the priority so clearly.
Yes. Again, Pat's exact same pattern across all domains. To the point of it being disturbing, like in the domain of medicine, in particular in the United States. I can't speak for the European situation. The amount of science that appears to be ultimately driven by pharmaceutical companies creating scientific research that happens to support the justification for products that are billions of dollars. This has been going on for decades. It's nauseating when you see that exact same pattern. They don't care. Just like the Dogus group doesn't necessarily care about archaeology, I think there's a whole lot of writing that is categorized as scientific literature where they don't care about the science. They don't actually care about the medicine. They care about justification for something that's going to make money. There's another thing you mentioned, though. This is so funny that you said, so there was this Corsetti fellow who claimed that the trees were damaging, and then the defenders of the orthodoxy came out. So I've coined this term that I'm applying to different cases of it's like the mafia. So there's a math mafia, believe it or not. When you start questioning things about some foundational concepts a century ago, the math mafia comes out and will attack you. You start, questioning things about the fundamentals of theoretical physics that were established a century ago. The physics mafia will come after you. Question different paradigms in health. The actual mafia will come after you. I don't know. I think there are some weird connections with the mob, perhaps, in the pharmaceutical industry, but that's a different question. But it sounds like there's the archaeology mafia as well. This is such an interesting pattern to observe, that it's like there's some circle of insiders that are the defenders of the orthodoxy, and it could be complete minutia. It can be in the philosophy of mathematics. There's these specific ideas that made it into the orthodoxy, and there are some people, I don't exactly know why. It's a mixture of preservation of status or preservation of psychology, because their self-conception is built around this idea being true. But I just see this everywhere. The ex-mafia, they're going to come out of the woodwork and tell you why this person's totally not credible, what they're saying is totally not credible, this is an incompetent person, let's dismiss them. Actually, the experts know what's going on. And then commonly, over some period of time, sometimes it takes decades, just like in this tree example, they turn out to be wrong. The circle of insiders who have their little idea, they are on the hunt to discredit anybody that is stepping outside of whatever the orthodoxy is at that time. And in hindsight, that same pattern of people, they keep getting it wrong. They keep picking the wrong fights, you know?
Because you would. Because if that is your position, if your position is that everything we now know is fixed and that is the final answer, that's just such a stupid position to take, because that's always going to be wrong. Because what are the chances of us having everything figured out in a particular discipline? It's basically zero. So, yeah, and there's a very, very vocal minority, I will say, in the kind of archaeological world that really make their voices heard in trying to scream and shout down any kind of idea that goes against the kind of current timeline. And I haven't really been exposed to it so far, but I reckon it's coming. I reckon they're going to come for me at some point. So I kind of look forward to it. I look forward to it, to be honest.
Yeah, it is definitely like a mafia, because even the way that you're describing that, you're on the other side of it, and you're like, oh yeah, that's probably going to come as soon as you reach a certain level, whatever the big interview you're going to get on some show. They're going to come after you. They're going to, who is this guy? He doesn't have the credentials. He's confused about the basics. And then they're going to start saying, oh, well, they're going to tell you about how trees aren't actually damaging. They're going to go down the scientific, they're going to claim to be experts, and you're going to have to wait some years before those claims are going to turn out to be false.
Yeah, probably. I mean, that's how it goes, though. I welcome it. I bring it on, I say.
Nice. I think that is the right mentality. Okay, so that really covers a lot of the big questions that I had for you. This has been an awesome conversation. I am curious, what are you envisioning in the future for your own brand? Is this the thing that you're planning on doing indefinitely? Are you gonna get a team together? Are you gonna do documentaries? Like, what's the Michael Button vision here?
Yeah, I mean, for the time being, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I mean, I just keep putting out these kind of videos and keep asking these questions and keep, kind of pushing at the mainstream narrative as much as I can. In the long term, yeah, I'd love to do something like, make longer videos, kind of documentary style videos. I'd also love to travel and go to more of these sites in person. I really hope that this channel gives me the ability to do that, because obviously that's hard to do, especially coming from the UK. I'm quite far away from pretty much everything. Like, the closest potential place I'd want to go is Egypt, and that's still a long way away. And then you've got so much fascinating ruins in South America, which is just an unbelievably far away. So I'd love if it could give me the opportunity to fly out to all these places around the world and make videos and, research these sites all over the globe, and potentially make longer form documentary style kind of productions would be an absolute dream. But at the moment, I'm just sticking to what I'm doing, and we'll see where it goes.
I'm going to make a prediction that's coming in the future. I think I can definitely envision you doing the on the ground stuff. I think you've got the whole package here in terms of it's interesting content, it's high quality content, and you're a good host. So I don't know where I can invest, but I'll invest in the thing that you're doing.
I hope so. I mean, I appreciate your kind words. I'm doing my best, and thanks for saying those things. But we'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll all fall apart tomorrow. Who knows?
The mafia is going to come for you, and then it'll be over. All right. Well, I'll end the conversation here, and thank you again for your time. Where can people go to see all of your content?
So they can just go to my YouTube channel. If you just type in Michael Button on YouTube, I should come up. I hope I come up. If I don't come up, then there's someone else out there who's got my brand. Yeah. So, but I mean, hopefully I'll come up. And then on X or Instagram, I'm just at Michael Button X. So you can follow me there. But YouTube's the main place. So check me out.
Great. All right. Thanks so much for your time. This has been an awesome conversation.
Thank you, Steve. I've loved being on. It's been a great show. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, it's been great fun.